Okay, so the next part of this force, movement, shape, and momentum would be our falling objects. The falling objects के बारे में we will be talking about their motion, their speed, velocity, acceleration, and the effect of all resultant forces on the falling objects as well. Forces acting on falling object. Now let's just imagine a case of a parachutist. When a parachutist jumps out of an aeroplane, two main forces act. Weight, which is the force of gravity, and the other one is known as the air resistance. So how do parachutes work? Can you name the force A? अब एक force आपके पास upwards लग रही है. The upward force which is A. Then we have a downward force as well and we call it B. So the question is, can you name the force A? Force A is acting to the opposite to the motion. First of all, what would be the motion of the parachutist? Downwards. इसका जो motion है, that is actually downwards. तो इसके जो opposite to the motion force लगेगी, we already talked about it in the previous topic, that would be your air resistance. Air resistance always acts opposite to the motion of the parachutist. Next is, can you name force B? Force B क्या हो जाएगी? Force B is weight due to the force of gravity. Downward force जो होती है, that is always going to be your weight. क्योंकि weight जब भी downward act करता है, obviously अगर gravity आपकी downwards है, then weight would also be downward. So the upward force would be your air resistance. And the downward force on a falling parachutist would be known as weight. And this weight is due to the gravitational force. इसको हम FG से भी denote करते हैं, due to the gravity. Air resistance is the opposite force क्योंकि आपका जो motion था, the motion of the parachutist was actually downwards. So the force which always acts opposite to the motion कौन सी act करेगी? The drag force. In this case, it is known as air resistance. So when a parachutist jumps out of an aeroplane, two main forces are acting. Number one, weight, जो कि downward act कर रही है, and the second one is air resistance that would always act upwards on a falling object. At first there is a downwards unbalanced force. अब इस पूरे falling object के अंदर what is the dynamics जो involve होती है in the falling object? पूरी dynamics involved है in the balancing and unbalancing of forces as well. अब वो dynamics क्या है? First of all, when you start falling, आपका weight जो होता है, weight is greater and air resistance is smaller. You can see that by the size of the arrows. अगर आप arrows की size देखें, the size of the arrows can easily tell you that weight over here is having a greater force, air resistance is having a lesser force. तो जो object है, that would be accelerating downwards. क्योंकि at first there is a downwards unbalanced force. Unbalanced force क्यों है ये? Because the magnitude of forces are different. Air resistance is smaller, जबकि weight over here is greater. We can see that by the size of the arrows, because I told you the size of the force or the magnitude of the force is determined by the size of the arrow as well. So at first there is a downwards unbalanced force and the person would accelerate. After a while, the forces balance. जो आपका scenario 2 है, after a while when the person starts falling, there comes a point where both the forces are equal to each other. जो आपकी air resistance थी and your weight, both are now equal to each other. Air resistance is equal to weight when we talk about case number 2. After a while, the forces balance. The person travels at a constant and terminal velocity. अब इस केस में क्या हुआ होगा? The resultant force, जो कि आपके पास FR है, the resultant force has now become zero. Resultant force is zero, which means that the acceleration would also be zero and the velocity. Now zero acceleration means that there is no change in velocity. मतलब कि velocity जो आपके पास हो जाएगी वो क्या हो जाएगी? Velocity would now be constant. This is when we talk about case number 2, जो कि आपके after a while, after case number 1, case number 2 applies after a while during the free fall. So after a while the forces finally balance. Balance forces का मतलब ये होता है that the resultant force is zero. और हमने कल दो conditions पढ़ी थी, that what are the two assumptions made when the resultant force is actually zero. Number one, the object would be at rest, but in this case the object is not at rest. तो फिर दूसरी assumption क्या हमने बताई थी? If the object is not at rest, it would be moving, but it won't be accelerating. It would just be moving at a constant speed. So जब भी resultant force zero होती, this is a very important point I'm repeating again, that whenever the force of whenever the resultant force is zero, the object is at rest, or If it is not at rest, it would be moving, but it would be moving at a constant terminal velocity. Terminal velocity को हम constant velocity भी कहते हैं. Then comes the third scenario. Third scenario में क्या होता है? After a while, when the same person opens the parachute, जैसे ही वो parachute open कर लेता है, now what happens is when the parachute is open, there is a big upwards unbalanced force. Again, there is an unbalanced force. In case number 1, there was an unbalanced force. Case number 2, there was a balanced force. Case number 3, there is again an unbalanced force. So when the parachute is open, there is a big upwards unbalanced force and the person slows down. Person क्यों slow down कर जाता है? In the first scenario, अगर हम पहले scenario को दोबारा देखें, where we had unbalanced forces, लेकिन in unbalanced forces के अंदर, the downward force weight was greater, air resistance was smaller, so the object was accelerating downwards, it was speeding up. In this case, we again have unbalanced forces, but यहाँ पे जो आपका weight है, that is smaller than the air resistance. Over here, the weight was greater than the air resistance. In first case, weight was greater than air resistance. In the second case, weight was less than air resistance. तो यहाँ पे आपके पास दोबारा से unbalanced forces आए. So when the parachute is open, there is a big upwards unbalanced force and the person slows down. क्योंकि आपको जो magnitude of air resistance है, that is much larger than the weight. अब आपका weight जो है, weight is smaller. The force of weight is smaller, whereas this is going to be greater. So overall resultant force कहाँ लगेगा? Upwards, and the object would slow down. That is why while opening a parachute, the person slows down and then falls at a lower speed. Forces acting on falling objects. Initially, the air resistance is very small. अगर हम पहले first scenario की बात करें, initially the air resistance is very small. There is a downwards unbalanced force, and the skydiver accelerates. यहाँ पे skydiver would accelerate. As the skydiver speeds up, the air resistance increases, and eventually at one point, the air resistance balances the weight. एक point वो आता है जब air resistance बिल्कुल weight के equal हो जाती है. यहाँ पे क्या था? Weight was greater than air resistance. When the parachute और फिर जब दोनों air resistance और weight equal हो जाते हैं, उसकी वजह से क्या होता है? The skydiver travels at a constant speed or a terminal velocity. Then when the parachute is open, the increased air resistance on the parachute creates an upwards unbalanced force. अब जो आपके पास unbalanced force लग रही है, उसका resultant ऊपर है. Why? Because now air resistance is greater than weight, making the parachute to actually slow down. तो ये आपके पास तीन important scenarios हैं when we talk about a case of parachute and a free falling normal object.